The morning mist clung to the Argonne forest like a shroud of death, and Major Charles White Whittlesey knew that October 2nd, 1918, would mark either triumph or disaster for his men. The dense undergrowth whispered with the movement of 554 soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 308th Infantry Regiment, 77th Division. As they prepared to push deeper into what the Germans had dubbed the Green Hell, Whittlesey, a tall, scholarly lawyer from Massachusetts, turned warrior, adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, and studied the crude map spread before him on a fallen log. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had been raging for days, and General John Joseph Pershing's American Expeditionary Forces were determined to break through the formidable Hindenburg Line. The forest ahead was a labyrinth of machine gun nests, barbed wire, and carefully positioned German strongholds that had been fortified for over 4 years. "Sir, the men are ready," reported Captain George McMurtry, Whittlesey's second-in-command and a Wall Street stockbroker who had traded his three-piece suits for olive-drab uniforms. McMurtry's weathered face bore the strain of weeks in the trenches, but his eyes still held the determination that had carried him through previous engagements. The battalion consisted primarily of men from New York City's melting pot. Italian immigrants from the Lower East Side, Jewish boys from Brooklyn, Irish laborers from Hell's Kitchen, and Polish factory workers who had barely learned English before being thrust into this European nightmare. They were ethnically diverse but united by a common purpose: to drive the Kaiser's forces back to Berlin and end the war that had already claimed millions of lives. As recorded in the New York Times archives from this period, the Argonne Forest represented one of the most challenging terrains on the Western Front, with its thick canopy blocking aerial reconnaissance and its ravines providing perfect defensive positions for German forces. Whittlesey received his orders through a runner who had somehow navigated the shell-torn landscape, advanced through the forest, capture Hill 244, and maintain position until relieving forces could exploit the breakthrough. It seemed straightforward on paper, but the major understood that nothing was simple in this war where technology had outpaced tactics, creating a deadly stalemate that consumed lives like a hungry beast. The advance began at 0600 hours, with companies A, B, C, and D moving in a diamond formation through the towering oak and beech trees. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that rustled underfoot, making stealth impossible. Every shadow could conceal a sniper. Every fallen log might hide a machine gun nest. And every clearing could be a kill zone zeroed in by German artillery. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky, a diminutive barber from the Bronx who spoke 4 languages, stayed close to Whittlesey as his primary runner. The 22-year-old had volunteered for the most dangerous job in the battalion, carrying messages between units when radio communication failed. His quick wit and fearless nature had already saved lives during previous engagements, earning him the respect of officers and enlisted men alike. The first resistance came at 0-8-30 when Company A encountered a German outpost. The sharp crack of Mauser rifles echoed through the trees, followed by the distinctive chatter of Maxim machine guns. American soldiers dove for cover behind massive tree trunks as bullets whined overhead, stripping bark and sending wooden splinters flying like deadly confetti. By noon on October 2nd, Whittlesey's battalion had penetrated deeper into German territory than any Allied unit in the sector. They had successfully overrun 3 defensive positions, capturing Hill 244, and establishing a perimeter in a depression that would soon become known to history as the Pocket. The natural bowl was surrounded by steep slopes covered in dense undergrowth, providing both protection and, unknown to the Americans, the perfect killing ground. The German Fourth Army, under Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, had been expecting this offensive. General Friedrich von Lossberg, the master of defensive warfare, had designed the Argonne positions as a series of interlocking strongpoints that would channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. Whittlesey's rapid advance had actually played into German hands, separating his battalion from supporting units and creating an isolated target. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Seckendorff-Aberdar commanded the German forces in this sector, and he quickly recognized the opportunity. By 1500 hours, his troops had quietly moved into positions that completely encircled the American battalion. Machine gun teams established overlapping fields of fire, while mortar crews registered their weapons on key points within the pocket. The trap was set with Prussian efficiency. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came when Private First Class Lowell Hollingshead, a farm boy from Kansas serving as a lookout, spotted German soldiers moving through the trees to their rear. He immediately reported to Sergeant Giedicke, who rushed the information to Captain McMurtry. Within minutes, the horrible reality became clear. They were surrounded. Whittlesey gathered his company commanders in the center of the pocket, their faces grim as the situation reports painted an increasingly desperate picture. German forces had infiltrated between them and the American lines, cutting off all routes of retreat. Attempts to send runners back to headquarters had failed, with 3 men already missing and presumed captured or killed. As documented in military records from the American Battle Monuments Commission, the Lost Battalion's position covered approximately 4 acres of heavily wooded terrain, with steep ravines on 3 sides and German positions commanding all approaches. "Gentlemen," Whittlesey said quietly, his voice carrying despite the distant sound of artillery, "we appear to be in something of a predicament. However, our orders were clear. Hold this position until relieved. That's exactly what we're going to do." The German attack began at 1600 hours with a thunderous artillery barrage that seemed to make the earth itself convulse. High explosive shells crashed through the forest canopy, sending ancient trees toppling like matchsticks. The concussion from the explosions knocked men to the ground, while shrapnel whistled through the air like angry hornets. Soldiers pressed themselves into hastily dug foxholes, covering their heads as debris rained down around them. Private Krotoshinsky crouched next to Whittlesey in a shell crater, both men flinching as a particularly close explosion showered them with dirt and leaves. The young barber shouted over the noise, "Major, shouldn't we try to fight our way out?" Whittlesey shook his head firmly. "Our orders are to hold this position. The relief forces will come. We just have to give them time." His confidence was partly genuine and partly an act for the benefit of his men, but leadership often required such performance in the face of impossible odds. When the barrage lifted, German infantry advanced from 3 directions simultaneously. The distinctive "ho, ho" battle cry echoed through the trees as gray-uniformed soldiers emerged from concealment. The Americans responded with devastating rifle fire, their Springfield Model 1903 rifles proving their worth in the hands of well-trained marksmen. Corporal Alvin York, though not part of this specific engagement, had demonstrated just days earlier what American marksmanship could accomplish. The men of the Lost Battalion carried that same spirit, picking their targets carefully and making every shot count. Machine gunner Private First Class Philip Sapaglia from Brooklyn kept his Browning automatic rifle chattering steadily, cutting down attackers as they tried to rush the American positions. October 3rd dawned gray and cold, with a persistent drizzle that turned the forest floor into a muddy quagmire. The Lost Battalion had survived their first night surrounded, but the situation grew more desperate with each passing hour. Water was running low, food supplies were nearly exhausted, and wounded men lay scattered throughout the pocket with no hope of medical evacuation. Major Whittlesey had spent the night moving from position to position, checking on his men and maintaining morale despite their increasingly hopeless situation. His quiet confidence and refusal to show fear had become a beacon of strength for soldiers, who were beginning to understand that they might not see another sunrise. The major's background as a lawyer had taught him the importance of precise communication, a skill that would prove crucial in the coming hours. At 700 hours, a German officer approached under a white flag, accompanied by an American soldier who had been captured during an earlier patrol. The prisoner, Private Carl Lindman from Company C, looked exhausted but unharmed as he delivered a message that would become one of the most famous exchanges in American military history. Major Whittlesey Lindman called out, his voice carrying across the no-man's land between the opposing forces, "The German commander wants to speak with you." The German officer, later identified as Lieutenant Heinrich Prinz, spoke excellent English, having studied at Columbia University before the war. His message was polite but firm. "The suffering of your wounded men can be heard over here in the German lines, and we are appealing to your humane sentiments to stop. A white flag shown by one of your men will tell us that you agree with these conditions." According to historical accounts preserved in the National Archives, this surrender demand represented a calculated psychological warfare tactic designed to break American morale during a critical phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Whittlesey's response was immediate and unequivocal. Without consulting his officers or considering the tactical situation, he turned his back on the German emissary and walked away. The message was clear. There would be no surrender, no negotiation, no compromise. His men, witnessing this display of defiance, felt their own resolve strengthen despite their desperate circumstances. Captain McMurtry later described the moment. The major didn't even dignify it with a verbal response. He just walked away, and we all knew that we'd fight to the last man if necessary. The German reaction was swift and brutal. Within an hour, the heaviest artillery barrage yet experienced crashed down upon the pocket. The bombardment was precisely targeted, suggesting that German observers had carefully mapped every American position during the night. Trees exploded into splinters, shell fragments whined through the air, and the very ground seemed to heave and buckle under the impact. Private Krotoshinsky huddled in a shell crater with 2 other soldiers, all of them covered in mud and debris. The young barber had been trying to establish communication with American forces using a captured German field telephone. But the constant shelling made any such effort impossible. Every wire was cut, every attempt at signaling was answered with increased enemy fire. During a brief lull in the bombardment, Sergeant Major Ben Gedege made a desperate decision. The 40-year-old veteran of the Spanish-American War had seen enough combat to understand their situation was rapidly becoming hopeless. Someone had to get through to headquarters with their exact position and current status. "I'm going to try to reach our lines," he told Whittlesey. "If I can get through, I'll make sure they know where we are and what we need." Whittlesey clasped the older man's shoulder. "Good luck, Sergeant Major. Tell them we're holding as ordered." Gedeke slipped out of the pocket just before midnight, crawling through German positions in the darkness. His knowledge of woodcraft, learned during childhood hunting trips in Pennsylvania, served him well as he navigated by starlight and sound. The journey that should have taken 30 minutes stretched into hours as he detoured around enemy strongpoints and waited in hiding while German patrols passed nearby. October 4th brought a new horror that would haunt the survivors of the lost battalion for the rest of their lives. At 0900 hours, the distinctive whistle of incoming American artillery shells sent the surrounded soldiers scrambling for cover, but this time they were seeking protection from their own forces. A tragic communication failure had resulted in friendly fire that would prove more devastating than any German attack. The shells came from the American 75th Artillery Regiment. Its gunners had received coordinates that placed them squarely on top of Whittlesey's position. The irony was bitter. While German artillery had been falling around them for days, American shells were now landing directly on their foxholes with deadly accuracy. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had endured enemy fire with stoic determination now faced the prospect of being killed by their own countrymen. Private First Class Omer Richards, a telegraph operator from Ohio, was among the first casualties of the friendly fire. Shell fragment tore through his chest as he attempted to reach his radio equipment, hoping to establish contact with the artillery battery and call off the bombardment. He died clutching the handset, his final words lost in the thunder of exploding ordnance. Major Whittlesey realized immediately that somehow their position had been misidentified or miscommunicated to friendly forces. The precision of the American barrage, combined with its devastating effect on his men, made it clear that this was no ranging error. Someone back at headquarters believed they were firing on German positions. Captain McMurtry, blood streaming from a head wound caused by shell fragments, crawled over to where Whittlesey had taken shelter. "Major, we've got to do something. Our own guns are killing us." Historical records from the 1st Army Artillery show that map coordinates had been incorrectly transmitted, leading to the targeting of American forces during this critical phase of the battle. The solution came from an unexpected source: the battalion's homing pigeons. These birds, trained to carry messages over long distances, represented their last hope for communication with the outside world. Whittlesey had been reluctant to use them earlier, knowing that once released, they couldn't be recalled if the message was intercepted or misunderstood. The most famous of these birds was a blue-checkered hen named Cher Ami, donated by British pigeon fanciers and trained by American handlers. The name meant "dear friend" in French, and she had already proven her worth by successfully delivering 2 messages during earlier engagements. Now she would face her greatest test. Private Krotoshinsky carefully prepared the message capsule, his hands shaking from exhaustion and stress. The note, written in Whittlesey's precise handwriting, would become one of the most famous military communications in American history. "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. Releasing cher ami required exposing themselves to both German and American fire. The pigeon loft had been established in a small clearing that offered the best chance for the bird to gain altitude and orient herself toward headquarters. As Krotoshinsky prepared to release her, German machine gunners spotted the movement and opened fire. Bullets cracked through the air around them as the young soldier released cher ami into the gray morning sky. The pigeon immediately came under fire from German positions, with soldiers trying to bring down what they correctly identified as a messenger bird. One bullet struck her breast, another shattered her right leg, but cher ami continued flying, her powerful wings carrying her above the forest canopy and toward the American lines 25 miles away. The friendly fire ceased within 2 hours of cher ami's departure, but the damage had already been done. 30 American soldiers lay dead or wounded from their own artillery, adding 2 casualties that were already approaching 50% of the battalion's original strength. Psychological impact was equally severe. Men who had maintained discipline under enemy fire now showed signs of breaking under the stress of being targeted by their own forces. Lieutenant Gordon Schenck, a young officer from Pennsylvania, had lost an arm to American shrapnel but continued directing his platoon's defensive efforts with grim determination. His example inspired others to maintain their positions despite the horror of the morning's events. October 5th marked the 4th day of the Lost Battalion's entrapment, and the situation had deteriorated beyond all reasonable hope of survival. The original force of 554 men had been reduced to fewer than 200 effective fighters. With dozens more wounded and unable to contribute to the defense, water had been completely exhausted for over 24 hours, and the last of their emergency rations had been consumed the previous evening. Major Whittlesey moved through a shrinking perimeter like a ghost, his uniform torn and stained with mud, blood, and the grime of prolonged combat. His wire-rimmed spectacles had been cracked by shrapnel, but he continued to project an image of calm confidence that belied the desperate reality of their situation. Every position he visited told the same story. Exhausted men holding rifles with trembling hands, their eyes hollow from lack of sleep and the constant stress of being hunted. The German forces surrounding them had been reinforced during the night, and Crown Prince Ruprecht had personally ordered that the American battalion be eliminated as an example to other Allied forces. The symbolic importance of the engagement had grown beyond its tactical significance. The Kaiser's forces could not allow a small group of American soldiers to hold German territory indefinitely. Major Riesenberger whispered as Whittlesey crawled up to his position. "They're bringing up the heavy stuff. Looks like they mean to finish us today." Whittlesey studied the German preparations through his cracked glasses, noting the methodical way enemy soldiers were positioning their weapons for maximum effect. His legal training had taught him to analyze evidence carefully, and everything he observed suggested that time had run out for the Lost Battalion. As documented in German military archives discovered after the war, General von Seckendorff-Faberdar had indeed been ordered to eliminate the American position by any means necessary, viewing it as a threat to the entire sector's defensive integrity. Captain McMurtry joined them in the observation post, his head wound now infected and causing him obvious pain. Despite his condition, he had refused to step down from command duties, insisting that every officer was needed to maintain discipline as their situation grew increasingly hopeless. George Whittlesey said quietly, using his friend's first name for the first time during the engagement, "I need you to know that if something happens to me, you're to continue the defense. No surrender, no matter what." McMurtry nodded grimly. "Understood, Charles, but let's hope it doesn't come to that." Private Krotoshinsky, still carrying messages between isolated positions, despite the overwhelming fire, witnessed scenes that would haunt him for decades. American soldiers, delirious from dehydration and exhaustion, continued fighting long after being mortally wounded. German attackers, equally desperate to end the engagement, pressed forward despite horrific casualties. October 6th brought an unexpected sound to the hellish landscape of the pocket, the distant rumble of American artillery. But this time the shells were falling on German positions. Somewhere beyond the forest, relief forces had finally located the Lost Battalion and were fighting their way forward. The sound of battle grew closer throughout the morning, accompanied by the distinctive crack of Springfield rifles and the chatter of American machine guns. Major Whittlesey, now commanding fewer than 150 effective soldiers, felt a surge of hope for the first time in days. His men, reduced to drinking muddy water from shell craters and eating tree bark to stave off starvation, suddenly found renewed strength as the sounds of approaching rescue grew louder. The relief force consisted of elements from the 3rd Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Cromwell Stacy. These fresh troops had been fighting continuously for 18 hours to break through German defensive lines and reach their trapped comrades. The advance had cost them dearly, over 200 casualties in less than a day, but they pressed forward with the knowledge that American lives depended on their success. Private First Class Clifton Bates, a farm boy from Iowa serving with the relief column, would later describe the scene. "We could hear the firing from the pocket getting weaker and weaker as we fought our way forward. We knew that every minute counted. Those boys were running out of everything." The German forces, caught between the advancing relief column and the stubborn defense of the lost battalion, found themselves in an increasingly untenable position. Crown Prince Ruprecht had already shifted reserves from other sectors to contain the American breakthrough. But the psychological impact of the lost battalion's resistance was spreading throughout the German ranks. At 3000 hours, first physical contact was established, when Sergeant James Lerman of the relief force spotted movement in the pocket through his field glasses. The distinctive shape of an American helmet confirmed what they had hoped. Some of Whittlesey's men were still alive and fighting. According to records preserved in the 77th Division's after-action reports, the breakthrough to the lost battalion represented one of the most difficult small-unit actions of the entire war, requiring precise coordination between infantry, artillery, and supporting elements. The link-up came at 15:45 hours on October 6th, when Private Lowell Hollingshead, the farm boy from Kansas who had first spotted German encirclement movements days earlier, saw American soldiers advancing through the trees toward their position. His shout of "Here come our boys" electrified the survivors, many of whom had given up hope of ever seeing friendly faces again. Lieutenant Colonel Stacy, leading his men personally through the final assault, was shocked by what he found in the pocket. The survivors looked more like scarecrows than soldiers, their uniforms hanging in tatters, their faces hollow from starvation and dehydration, their eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much death. Major Whittlesey, still wearing his cracked spectacles and maintaining military bearing despite his condition, formally reported to Stacy with words that would echo through military history. "Lieutenant Colonel, the lost battalion is ready for relief." The casualty count was staggering. Of the original 554 men who had entered the Argonne forest 5 days earlier, only 194 were still alive. Of these survivors, many were wounded, and all were suffering from exposure, dehydration, and malnutrition. The human cost of holding that insignificant piece of forest had been enormous. Captain McMurtry, barely conscious from blood loss and infection, was among the first to be evacuated. As stretcher bearers carried him toward the rear lines, he managed to whisper to one of his rescuers, "Tell them we held. Tell them we never gave up." Private Krotoshinsky, the diminutive barber who had served as Whittlesey's primary runner throughout the ordeal, was found unconscious in a shell crater with 3 German bullets in his body. He had been attempting to reach an isolated group of American soldiers when the relief force arrived, still carrying messages despite his wounds. The rescue of the lost battalion, on October 6, 1918, marked not only the end of one of the most harrowing small-unit actions in American military history, but it's also the beginning of a legend that would inspire generations of soldiers. As the survivors were evacuated from the pocket, carried on stretchers, or supported by medics through the same forest paths where they had advanced so confidently 5 days earlier, the magnitude of their achievement began to emerge. Major Charles White Whittlesey, still refusing medical attention until all his men had been cared for, stood among the shattered trees and counted the cost of their stand. The mathematics were brutal but simple. They had held a strategically important position against overwhelming odds, tying down an entire German division that could have been used elsewhere along the front. The tactical value of their sacrifice would become clear in the weeks that followed, as American forces exploited the gaps created by German attempts to eliminate the lost battalion. General John Joseph Pershing himself arrived at the aid station where the survivors were being treated. His usually stern demeanor softened by what he witnessed. The commanding general of the American Expeditionary Forces moved from bed to bed, speaking quietly with wounded soldiers who had given everything for their country. When he reached Whittlesea, the conversation was brief but meaningful. Major Pershing said simply, "The nation is proud of you and your men." Whittlesea, his voice hoarse from days of shouting orders through artillery barrages, replied with characteristic understatement, "General, we just did our duty." The story of the lost battalion spread rapidly throughout the American forces in France. Carried by newspapers, letters home, and the inevitable soldier's grapevine that connected units across the Western Front, the tale grew in the telling. The essential facts remained unchanged. A small group of American soldiers had refused to surrender despite impossible odds, maintaining their position until relief arrived. As recorded in contemporary accounts by war correspondents, including Damon Runyon of the New York American, the Lost Battalion's stand became a symbol of American determination and fighting spirit during the final phase of the Great War. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky recovered from his wounds and received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions as a runner under fire. His small stature and humble background as a Bronx barber made him an unlikely hero, but his courage under fire embodied the spirit of the immigrant soldiers who had traveled from America's cities to fight in European forests. Cher-ami, the homing pigeon who had carried their desperate plea to stop the friendly fire, became perhaps the most famous bird in American military history. Despite her wounds, she had completed her 25-mile flight in just over 2 hours, delivering the message that saved dozens of American lives. She was later awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government and became a symbol of loyalty and duty. Captain George McMurtry survived his wounds and returned to Wall Street after the war, but he never forgot the lessons learned in the Argonne forest. He remained close friends with Whittlesea until the Major's death in 1921, maintaining that the bond forged in combat transcended all other relationships. The German forces that had surrounded the Lost Battalion paid their own price for the extended engagement. The division that had been committed to their elimination suffered over 3,000 casualties during the 5-day battle, losses that weakened the entire sector's defensive capabilities. Crown Prince Ruprecht later wrote in his memoirs that the American battalion's resistance had demonstrated a level of determination that German commanders had not expected from relatively inexperienced troops. Major Whittlesea received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the engagement, though he remained characteristically modest about his role. In his citation, the award recognized not just personal courage, but the ability to inspire ordinary men to extraordinary acts of heroism under impossible circumstances. The Lost Battalion's stand in the Argonne Forest became a defining moment in American military history, demonstrating that citizen soldiers, properly led and motivated, could match the fighting qualities of any professional army in the world. Their sacrifice helped secure the final Allied victory that came just 35 days after their rescue. When Germany agreed to the armistice that ended the Great War, the memory of those 5 days in October 1918 would live on in American military tradition, a testament to the truth that ordinary men, faced with extraordinary circumstances, are capable of extraordinary heroism. In the pocket where they made their stand, a monument now marks the spot where the Lost Battalion proved that some things are worth more than life itself: honor, duty, and loyalty to the men who shared the brotherhood of arms. Their story became a cornerstone of American military heritage, taught in service academies and remembered in veterans' halls, ensuring that future generations would understand the price of freedom and the courage required to defend it. The Lost Battalion had found immortality in the Argonne Forest, their names forever linked with the finest traditions of American arms.